Hey, church family, it's time for Bible study. We're going to continue our series on the so-called Apocrypha, the or the intertestamental books that were part of the Old Testament in the time of Jesus and remained in our Bibles until just very recently in history, the last few hundred years. They began to disappear from our Bibles. And the reasons for that are we discussed, but we want to reinsert them in our Bibles because they're very important. They're not important for Christian doctrine so much as they are to give us the needed history to know the fulfillment of prophecy, especially important for Ezekiel and Daniel. The fulfillment of these prophecies and those prophetic words are documented here in these books. And most importantly, that period of time is documented in the 4 books of the Maccabees. Now, we went through that history a little bit, and that Maccabee is an adaptation of an Aramaic word for hammer and describes Judas Maccabeus, who nicknamed the Hammer, who was the great military leader that led in the revolt against the Greek Empire and the reinstitution of the Hebrew religion, which had been abandoned by its priests and leaders. This is a very important period of time leading up to the revelation of God's Messiah, the coming of Jesus. So it's very important we know this. I'm just really dismayed how few Christians are aware of these important historical books as part of the Old Testament. And so we'll continue with 2nd Maccabees this week. Last week I did a fairly superficial flyover of 1st Maccabees. It's written from a Hebrew perspective. It tends to minimize, it doesn't exonerate the Jews from their complicity in this tragic period of time in the Jewish history of the Jewish nation. It does kind of minimize it a little bit and places a lot of the blame on Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, who it was certainly a deranged and evil leader. And we'll hear a lot more about him here in 2nd Maccabees. But in 2nd Maccabees, this story is told with some informality that's not found in 1st Maccabees. It gives some more details. It tells some of the stories of the spiritual warfare that was going on, not just the military warfare, that there was great battle and great upheaval in the spiritual realms, and there were stories here of great faith and bravery on behalf of many of the Jewish nation. Now, this is that period of time in Daniel where it says, and the people of God will be mighty and do exploits. And it's speaking of this period in time. Those latter chapters of Daniel find their fulfillment in this story that's told by these 4 books of the Maccabees. Now, the 2nd book, like I said, begins with a couple of letters. Now, these are meant to be presented as letters that were written by the hand of someone, somewhere. They're not meant to be epistles on the order of the epistles of Paul or Peter or John. This is not doctrinal. It is not meant to be considered as verbally inspired, in my opinion. It is historical. Now, we will see in the 2nd letter, at the beginning, it will tell the story of the death of Antiochus Epiphanes that's contradicted in the details of his death later in the book, in the 3rd letter written by someone else. And so the fact that there's contradictory information is important to remember. But it does tell the story, and it will tell the story of other parts of history that I think are very interesting. I think they have spiritual importance. You know, these books should be read like any other religious books. They're great books that are written these days that seem inspired and carry very great spiritual weight, but we don't consider them scripture in the sense that they're verbally inspired and infallible, etc. These can be approached at minimum in the same way. There are some of the books of the Apocrypha that are quoted in the New Testament as scripture and alluded to. There are things in there that clear up some issues that The rest of the Bible is completely silent on, and we'll get to those in due course. But tonight, I want us to take a look at 2nd Maccabees. I think we'll take several classes on this book because these stories are fascinating and they make great stories of great faith in time of trial. So here in 2nd Maccabees, the first chapter, it begins with a couple of letters. And again, these letters will contain a few things that may be contradicted later, but that's to be expected. They're just meant to be a collection of letters that were sent to the Jews in exile to explain a little bit about what their homeland had been going through. So here, the first letter, and the book opens with it. It says, "To our Jewish brothers and sisters in Egypt," to the very large Jewish population in Alexandria and other parts of Egypt. It says, "Greetings. Your Jewish brothers and sisters in Jerusalem and in the country of Judea wish you prosperous peace. May God do good for you and remember the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his faithful servants. May God give to all of you the passion to worship him and to do his will with a whole heart and a willing spirit. May God open your heart to his law and commands and give you peace. May God listen to your prayers and be reconciled with you and not abandon you in an evil time. We are praying for you here in Jerusalem." This in verse 7, it says, "And in the year 169," now this is how, as the Greeks reckoned their calendar. This was the Greek year 169, and it would correspond with the year 143 BC, 143 years before the birth of Christ. "During the rule of Demetrius, we Jews wrote to you during a critical period of suffering that happened to us in the years after Jason and his followers revolted from the Holy Land and the kingdom." Again, this is Jason, the evil high priest that abandoned the sacrifices and had the gymnasium built handy to the temple so the priests could neglect the sacrifices but catch the wrestling matches. So Jason and his followers revolted from the Holy Land and the kingdom. They burned down the gate and murdered innocent people. We pleaded to the Lord, and the Lord heard us. We offered sacrifices and fine flour, lit the lamps, and set out the sacred loaves. We rededicated the temple. So now you should keep the festival of booths in the month of Kislev in the year 188. Again, that corresponds with 124 BC. So here, the point of this letter is to reset the date for the observance of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Festival of Booths. And it had been neglected. It was being reinstituted, and Jerusalem was now a safe and fit place for that festival to resume, and they are resetting the date to observe it, to accommodate the new feast of dedication, where they would celebrate the rededication of the temple after the civil war that is called the Maccabean revolt. And so here he's just mentioning that the temple has been rededicated. We have this new festival, which is still celebrated to this day as Hanukkah. It's in John's Gospel. We have Jesus celebrating this new festival by walking in the court of the Gentiles, and that's another fascinating story. But this first letter is merely meant to remind them that the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles would be reset. Now here's the second letter. And it says, "The citizens of Jerusalem and Judea, the council of elders, and Judas," meaning Judas Maccabees, "send greetings and wishes of good health to Aristobulus, teacher of King Ptolemy and a member of the family of the anointed priests, and to the Jews in Egypt." Now here, Aristobulus is had been an advisor to Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, who were really co-regents for a period of time. It was not unusual for an emperor and his son to rule jointly, and that was certainly the case with Ptolemy I and II. And so here he's writing in the time of Ptolemy II, who has an advisor, Aristobulus, who's evidently Jewish and actually a member of the priestly families of the Jews in Egypt. Verse 11, God saved us from great danger when we were battling against the king. And here the king is not Ptolemy. It's mentioned as Antiochus, which was a rival of Ptolemy's. Again, Ptolemy being the king of the south, and Antiochus being the king of the north in prophetic literature. So we greatly praise God because he forced those fighting in the holy city to leave. They ran them out. It says, the ruler and his armed forces that went into Persia seemed invincible. So Antiochus draws his attention away from Jerusalem for a while, and he goes to Persepolis in Persia. And this story is what's going to be told. Now, this is going to tell a story of the death of Antiochus that's contradicted in the details of this third letter. So remember, these are people writing letters, and they may have gotten the story wrong. So just keep that in mind. It says, the ruler and his armed forces that went into Persia seemed invincible, meaning Antiochus Epiphanes. But they were slain in the goddess Nenea's temple, when Nenea's priests tricked them. Since Antiochus came in order to marry the goddess, he and his political advisors came into the temple to take the great wealth as payment for her dowry. That's a strange story. When the priests of Nenea had set it out, the king entered with a few men into the enclosed space of the shrine. After closing off the temple as Antiochus entered and opening the hidden door of the ceiling, they threw stones that struck down the ruler like a bolt of lightning. After dismembering and beheading the bodies, they tossed the heads out to those outside. May our God, who gave up the immoral to death, be praised in every way. Now, certainly Antiochus does die as a result of his misadventures in Persia, but like Daniel foretells, it will not be at the hands of men. And so this actually contradicts what Daniel says will happen to Antiochus. And the story of what really happened is later in the second Maccabees, which we'll read when we get there, is very much in line with the fulfillment of that prophecy. But this is a little contradictory information right here. And then it goes on, though, to tell about how and why the festival for the rededication of the temple is being celebrated. In verse 18, it says, since we're about to celebrate the cleansing of the temple on the 25th of Kislev, this is the same month as the Feast of Tabernacles would be observed, the 25th of Kislev, this is always in the winter, we thought it right to notify you so that you yourselves might also celebrate the festival of booths and fire, when Nehemiah offered sacrifices after he had built the temple and the altar. So here they're going to correspond, they're going to tie together this festival, this new festival of rededication, or Feast of Dedication, and tie it with the Feast of Tabernacles. And it remains that way to this day. It says, when Nehemiah, to celebrate the festival of booths and fire. And what follows here is the story of the fire of the altar. Now, let's get a little background before we go into the story, because it's an interesting story. That when Moses built the altar of the tabernacle in the wilderness and dedicated it, God sent fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice. And that fire was perpetuated. It was never allowed to go out. And any attempt to offer strange fire was met with violence from heaven, if you remember that story. And so here it tells about that it follows the history of the fire of the altar through some very unfortunate times. And it's a very interesting story. And it begins to shed light on the nature of the temple cult, the temple worship in the time of Jesus, and the sorry state of affairs that it was. So here, again, let's pick up. It says, so that you yourselves might also celebrate the festival of booths and fire, when Nehemiah offered sacrifices after he had built the temple and the altar. It says, when our ancestors were taken as captives into Persia, this is the Babylonian captivity, the holy priests secretly took the fire of the altar and hid it in a dry pit. They were careful that no one knew the place. So here was their attempt to take that fire that was lit in the wilderness at the time of the Exodus, had been maintained continuously until the time of the Babylonian captivity. They wanted to hide it away to preserve it. But let's read on. It says, many years later, when it seemed good to God, Nehemiah, who was commissioned by the king of Persia, sent the descendants of the priest who had hidden the fire to retrieve it, after they explained to us that they didn't find the fire, to retrieve it. They didn't find the fire, but rather a thick liquid. He ordered them to bring the liquid. And when they brought up the thick liquid, he ordered them to bring, when they brought up the provisions for the sacrifice, Nehemiah commanded the priests to sprinkle the liquid on the wood and on the items lying there. And sometime after they did this, as the sun shone brightly from behind the clouds, a great fire flared up and astonished everyone. While the sacrifices were burning, the priests prayed, the priests and all the people. Jonathan took the lead while the others, including Nehemiah, responded, and the prayer went like this. Now here is an attempt to attribute a miraculous source for the fire of the altar of the second temple after it was rebuilt. You remember the story of the fire at the altar of the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then the fire of the first temple upon its dedication, which lasted 8 days, by Solomon, that God sent fire to relight the altar of the new temple. And so after the restoration of the temple and after return from Babylon, they sought a miraculous relighting of that fire to resume their sacrifices, and the fire wasn't found, and it had to be relit. And this time the fire didn't come from God. We'll find out where it came from. So I'll let you read that prayer, and we'll skip down to the 30th verse. It says, the priests sang the hymns. When the elements of the sacrifice were consumed, Nehemiah commanded them to pour the remaining liquid on larger stones. When this happened, a flame flared up on those stones, but it went out in the presence of the light shining from the altar. When this situation became known, it was reported to the king of the Persians that in the place where the exiled priests hid the fire, a liquid appeared from which Nehemiah's followers purified the elements of the sacrifice. After fencing off the place and declaring it holy, the king examined the matter. The king showed favor to those involved and presented many excellent gifts to them. Nehemiah's circle called this liquid nectar, which means purification, but most people call it naphtha, lighter fluid. This is an interesting story because in the apocalypse of animals in the book of Enoch, the second temple and its sacrifices are referred to as a corrupted table. In other words, the fire of this altar is not from God. It's from lighter fluid. Now that's very interesting because we don't know the source of the flame later in the story as it's told here. So that's very interesting, and it begins to paint the picture of, in fact, a corrupted table in the house of the Lord that will require redemption and the sacrifice of a perfect lamb in the person of Jesus. So we begin to build this picture that there, and we'll get to another story maybe here tonight, possibly. But there's another interesting story that follows, and it's the story of an envoy of the wicked king Antiochus named Heliodorus, and of God's miraculous intervention. Now, 2 Macabbees will tell the story of spiritual warfare, whereas the first Maccabees is a fairly straightforward history, a secular history of that warfare, although they do depend on God and pray for his mercy and for the victory which God gives. There are a lot of supernatural elements that are left out of the story that we'll find here. And it begins with this story of Heliodorus. And I'll read. It says, when the holy city was living in harmony and people observed the laws rigorously because of Onias the high priest, who was devoted to God and hated evil, the kings used to honor the place and glorify the temple by sending the best gifts. Seleucus, the king of Asia, even supplied all the expenses for the sacrificial service from his own revenues. So here's Seleucus, for whom the Seleucid Greek Empire is named, is honoring the temple of God in Jerusalem and even paying for much of the sacrificial service. It says, but a certain Simon from the tribe of Benjamin, who had been appointed administrator of the temple, had a difference of opinion with the high priest about the management of the city market. Since he wasn't able to overcome Onias, he went to Thracias' son Apollonius, who was governor of Syria and Phoenicia at that time. Simon told him that the treasury in Jerusalem was filled with untold riches and that it was full of uncounted cash, which didn't belong to the accounts for the sacrifices, but potentially fell under the king's authority. Apollonius met with the king and told him about the funds. The king chose his chief administrator, Heliodorus, and sent him with orders to confiscate the funds in question. Heliodorus immediately made the journey, supposedly to inspect the cities of Syria and Phoenicia, but actually to put the king's plan into effect. When he arrived in Jerusalem and was received in a friendly manner by the high priest of the city, Onias, he revealed the information that had been reported and stated plainly why he had come. Then he asked whether these things were true. The high priest informed him that these were the deposits of widows and orphans, and also some deposits of Hyrcanus the Tobiad, an exceedingly prominent man. He also said that there was only 22,800 pounds of silver and 11,400 pounds of gold, and that the ungodly Simon had given a false report. It was wholly unthinkable, he added, to commit such an injustice against those who trusted in the holiness of the place and in the dignity and the sacredness of the temple that is honored throughout the whole world. But Heliodorus, because of the royal commands, was firm in any case the king could take these funds. So he set a date and proceeded to inspect these funds. This caused great agony throughout the whole city, but the priests threw themselves down before the altar in their priestly robes and called to heaven to the one who had given the laws about such deposits, that he should keep the deposits safe. Anyone seeing the outward appearance of the high priest would have been heartbroken because of his expression and changed color revealed his inner anguish. Fear and trembling seized the man, making the grief lodged in his heart clear to observers. People burst from their houses in crowds to plead for help because the temple was about to be dishonored. With mourning clothes wrapped beneath their breasts, women filled the streets. The virgins who usually remained indoors ran together to the gates and some to the walls, while others peeped through their windows. But all raised up their hands to heaven and pleaded for help. To see the whole crowd on its knees and faces in the great suffering and dread of the high priest was a pitiful sight. So they called on the Almighty Lord to protect the deposits for those who had entrusted them. These are the days of the last righteous high priest. It's this Onias that is the prince of the covenant that will be lost in the prophecy of Daniel. And we'll read the story of his murder. It says, but Heliodorus carried on with what had been decided. And when he and his spearmen approached the treasury, however, the ruler of all spirits and all authority made an awesome display. God shows up. Terrified and awestruck by God's power, a horse appeared to them with a fearsome rider and decked out with a beautiful saddle. This is a spiritual warrior. While running furiously, the horse attacked Heliodorus with its front hooves. The rider appeared to be clothed in full body armor made of gold. 2 young men also appeared before him, unmatched in bodily strength, of superb beauty and with magnificent robes, angels. They stood on either side of Heliodorus and beat him continuously with many blows. When he suddenly fell to the ground unconscious, his men grasped him and placed him on a stretcher. This was the same man who had just entered the treasury with a large group of men and a full bodyguard, and now they carried him away helpless despite his weapons, and they publicly acknowledged God's power. While he was being cut down and left speechless through the divine power and deprived of all hope of recovery, the people were praising the Lord for acting miraculously on behalf of his holy place. And the temple, which had been weighed down with fear and disturbance a short time earlier, was now filled with delight and joy because the Almighty Lord had publicly appeared. Some of Heliodorus' companions rushed to ask Onias to pray to the Most High to give life to the one who was about to draw his last breath. The high priest, fearful that perhaps the king might think that the Jews had done something evil to Heliodorus, offered a sacrifice for the man's recovery. And while the high priest was making the sacrifice for reconciliation, the same two young men, dressed in the same clothing, appeared again to Heliodorus. They stood by him and said, "You owe Onias, the high priest, your gratitude. Because of him, the Lord has graciously given life to you. But you who suffered a beating from heaven must proclaim the great power of God to all." And once they said these things, they disappeared. Heliodorus offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made many solemn promises to the Savior for sparing his life. After thanking Onias, he took his military force back to the king. He testified to everyone about the works of the great God that he had seen with his own eyes. When the king asked Heliodorus who would be the right sort of person to send again to Jerusalem, Heliodorus said, "Well, if you have an enemy or someone plotting against you, your government, send him, and he'll come back badly beaten if he should come back at all." Because some divine power truly surrounds the temple. The one who lives in heaven watches over that place and will strike and destroy anyone coming with evil intent. And so this is how matters turned out concerning Heliodorus and the guarding of the treasury. It's an interesting story. That's told here about Seleucus and his minister Heliodorus. And we see this supernatural vein run throughout the story told here in 2 Maccabees. Now let me see where we are in time. We're already at about 30 minutes. So we'll pick up with the I skipped the second chapter. That was the third chapter. I skipped the second chapter. Well, stuff happens. Well, we'll go back and do the second chapter because it's really a very important continuation of the story of the rededication of the temple. I don't know how my program skipped that chapter. Well, we'll do second chapter next week. And until then, church family, take care.